evening. It is the 5th of July, Sunday evening. My name is Joyce, and now I would like to introduce you to a book that I have been reading. Unfortunately, I'm always reading more than one book at the same time, so I sort of tend to get lost, so then things take longer. But as I said before, I would want to talk about books that I'm reading, and one of those books I have been reading is Zbigniew Brzezinski's The Grand Chessboard. I hope you can see that. Zbigniew Brzezinski was the counselor for Lyndon B from 1966 to 1968, and from 1977 to 81 he was the National Security Advisor for Jimmy Carter. As far as I know, he is now a professor at some university in America. Very influential man, very influential. This book was written in 1997, or not written but published in 1997. I would like you to keep that in mind when I start reading out of this book to you, because I think that is extremely telling about American foreign policies, the view of themselves within this world. I think they pretty much view themselves still as an empire. So it's a very interesting book. So now it starts with the introduction, Superpower Politics, and starts with, ever since the continents started interacting politically some 500 years ago, Eurasia has been the center of world power. In different ways, at different times, the peoples inhabiting Eurasia, though mostly those from its Western European periphery, penetrated and dominated the world's other regions as individual Eurasian states, attained the special status and enjoyed the privileges of being the world's premier powers. The last decade of the 20th century has witnessed a tectonic shift in world affairs. For the first time ever, a non-Eurasian power has emerged not only as the key arbiter of Eurasian power relations, but also as the world's paramount power. The defeat and collapse of the Soviet Union was the final step in the rapid ascendance of a Western Hemisphere power, the United States, as the sole and indeed the first truly global power. So this is kind of how Mr. Brzezinski starts off, and I'm just gonna jump through a little bit. Can't read everything to you. Okay, now he talks about America. Unlike earlier empires, this vast and complex global system is not a hierarchical pyramid. Rather, America stands at the center of an interlocking universe, one in which power is exercised through continuous bargaining, dialogue, diffusion, and quest for formal consensus, even though that power originates ultimately from a single source, namely Washington, D.C. And that is where the power game has to be played, and played according to America's domestic rules. Perhaps the highest compliment that the world pays to the centrality of the democratic progress in American global hegemony is the degree to which foreign countries are themselves drawn into the domestic American political bargaining. I will jump a little bit here. American supremacy has thus produced a new international order that not only replicates but institutionalizes abroad many of the features of the American system itself. Its basic features include a collective security system, including integrated command and forces, then in brackets NATO, the US-Japan Security Treaty, and so forth. Regional economic cooperation, in brackets APEC, NAFTA, which is the North American Free Trade Agreement, and specialized global cooperative institutions like the World Bank, IMF, WTO. Procedures that emphasize consensual decision-making even if dominated by the United States. A preference for democratic membership within key alliances. A rudimentary global constitutional and judicial structure ranging from the World Court to a special tribunal to try Bosnian war crimes. Most of that system emerged during the Cold War as part of America's effort to contain its global rival, the Soviet Union. It was thus ready-made for global application once that rival faltered and America emerged as the first and only global power. Its essence has been well encapsulated by the political scientist G. John Eikenberry. It was hegemonic in the sense that it was centered around the United States and reflected American-styled political mechanisms and organizing principles. It was a liberal order in that it was legitimate and marked by reciprocal interactions. Europeans, one may also add the Japanese, were able to reconstruct and integrate their societies and economies in ways that were congenial with American hegemony, but also with room to experiment with their own autonomous and semi-independent political systems. The evolution of this complex system served to domesticate, or is it domesticate? Maybe it's domesticate relations among the major Western states. There have been tense conflicts between these states from time to time, but the important point is that conflict has been contained within a deeply embedded, stable, and increasingly articulated political order. The threat of war is off the table. Currently, the unprecedented American global hegemony has no rival. But will it remain unchallenged in the years to come? Then he talks about geostrategic players and geopolitical pivots. In the current global circumstances, at least 5 key geostrategic players and 5 geopolitical pivots, with 2 of the latter perhaps also partially qualifying as players, can be identified on Eurasia's new political map. France, Germany, Russia, China and India are major and active players, whereas Great Britain, Japan and Indonesia, while admittedly very important countries, do not so qualify. Ukraine, Azerbaijan, South Korea, Turkey and Iran play the role of critically important geopolitical pivots, though both Turkey and Iran are to some extent within their more limited capabilities also geostrategically active. More will be said about each in subsequent chapters. I'm just chucking a few of these sentences at you. Always bear in mind this is published 1997. So, Ukraine. A new and important space on the Eurasian chessboard is a geopolitical pivot because its very existence as an independent country helps to transform Russia. Without Ukraine, Russia ceases to be a Eurasian empire. Russia without Ukraine can still strive for imperial status, but it would then become a predominantly Asian imperial state, more likely to be drawn into a debilitating conflict with aroused Central Asians, who would then be resentful of the loss of their recent independence and would be supported by their fellow Islamic states to the south. Next interesting little bit here. A policy for a united Europe will also have to address, though jointly with the Europeans, the highly sensitive issue of Europe's geographic scope. How far eastward should the European Union extend? Now, given that in 1990 the German wall came down, and at similarly the same time the Soviet Union broke down as well, I do remember that at the time the president of the Soviet Union was Mikhail Gorbachev, and you can look it up or also go to YouTube, find videos about it. There are even interviews with Mikhail Gorbachev where he clearly states that there was a deal that the European Union would not extend itself to the east. That was a deal, unfortunately apparently only verbally agreed. There's never been anything in written form, and then shortly thereafter then there was a change of president in the broken down Soviet Union, and we had Boris Yeltsin following into Gorbachev's shoes, and as we all know, he was often not quite there. Okay. So, in America that truly desires a united and hence also a more independent Europe will have to throw its weight behind those European forces that are genuinely committed to Europe's political and economic integration. Such a strategy will also mean junking the last vestiges of the once hallowed US-UK special relationship. A policy for a united Europe will also have to address, though jointly, oh, blimey, I jumped. Okay. Though jointly with the Europeans, the highly sensitive issue of Europe's geographic scope, and then again, how far eastward should the European Union extend, and should the eastern limits of the EU be synonymous with the eastern front line of NATO? The former is more a matter for a European decision, but a European decision on that issue will have direct implications for a NATO decision. The latter, however, engages the United States, and the US voice in NATO is still decisive. Given the growing consensus regarding the desirability of admitting the nations of Central Europe into both the EU and NATO, the practical meaning of this question focuses attention on the future status of the Baltic republics and perhaps also that of, here, Ukraine. So, Ukraine is being mentioned here again and again. Let us go on here. US policy toward the vital geopolitical pivots of Ukraine and Azerbaijan cannot skirt that issue, and America thus faces a difficult dilemma regarding tactical balance and strategic purpose. Internal Russian recovery is essential to Russia's democratization and eventual Europeanization. But any recovery of its imperial potential would be inimical to both of these objectives. Moreover, it is over this issue that differences could develop between America and some European states, especially as the EU and NATO expand. Should Russia be considered a candidate for eventual membership in either structure? And what then about Ukraine? The costs of the exclusion of Russia could be high, creating a self-fulfilling prophecy in the Russian mindset. But the results of dilution of either the EU or NATO could also be quite destabilizing. Whatever the future, it is reasonable to conclude that American primacy on the Eurasian continent will be buffeted by turbulence and perhaps at least by sporadic violence. America's primacy is potentially vulnerable to new challenges, either from regional contenders or novel constellations. The currently dominant American global system, within which the threat of war is off the table, is likely to be stable only in those parts of the world in which American primacy, guided by a long-term geostrategy, rests on compatible and congenial socio-political systems linked together by American-dominated multilateral frameworks. Swallow that. And here the next chapter is grandeur and redemption. For Germany, a commitment to Europe is the basis for national redemption, while an intimate connection to America is central to its security. Accordingly, a Europe more assertively independent of America is not a viable option. For Germany, redemption plus security plus Europe plus America. That formula defines Germany's posture and policy, making Germany simultaneously Europe's truly good citizen and America's strongest European supporter. Yeah, how lovely, the little German. America's central objective. The central issue for America is how to construct a Europe that is based on the Franco-German connection, a Europe that is viable, that remains linked to the United States, and that widens the scope of the cooperative democratic international system on which the effective exercise of American global primacy so much depends. Hence, it is not a matter of making a choice between France and Germany. Without either France or Germany, there will be no Europe. Three broad conclusions emerge from the foregoing discussion. First, American engagement in the course of European unification is needed to compensate for the internal crisis of morale and purpose that has been sapping European vitality, to overcome the widespread European suspicion that ultimately America does not favor genuine European unity, and to infuse into the European undertaking the needed dose of democratic fervor. That requires a clear-cut American commitment to the eventual acceptance of Europe as America's global partner. It's really, you really need to kind of let these words sink in, read between the lines, to get a notion of what the self-view here is and what the view of the rest of the world is. Second, I do apologize for sometimes stuttering, and that's just the way it is. Second, in the short run, tactical opposition to French policy and support for German leadership is justified. In the longer run, European unity will have to involve a more distinctive European political and military identity if a genuine Europe is actually to become reality. That requires some progressive accommodation to the French view regarding the distribution of power within transatlantic institutions. Third, neither France nor Germany is sufficiently strong to construct Europe on its own, or to resolve with Russia the ambiguities inherent in the definition of Europe's geographic scope. That requires energetic, focused, and determined American involvement, particularly with the Germans, in defining Europe's scope, and hence also in coping with such sensitive, especially to Russia, issues as the eventual status within the European system of the Baltic republics and Ukraine. Can't say it often enough. 1997! The essential point regarding NATO expansion is that it is a progress integrally connected with Europe's own expansion. If the European Union is to become a geographically larger community with a more integrated Franco-German leading core and less integrated outer layers, and if such a Europe is to base its security on a continued alliance with America, then it follows that its geopolitically most exposed sector, Central Europe, cannot be demonstratively excluded from partaking in the sense of security that the rest of Europe enjoys through the transatlantic alliance. On this, America and Germany agree. For them, the impulse for enlargement is political, historical, and constructive. It is not driven by animosity towards Russia, nor by fear of Russia, nor by the desire to isolate Russia. Hence, America must work particularly closely with Germany in promoting the eastward expansion of Europe. American-German cooperation and joint leadership regarding this issue are essential. Expansion will happen if the United States and Germany jointly encourage the other NATO allies to endorse the step and either negotiate effectively some accommodation with Russia if it is willing to compromise, or act assertively in the correct conviction that the task of constructing Europe cannot be subordinated to Moscow's objections. Combined American-German pressure will be especially needed to obtain the required unanimous agreement of all NATO states. But no NATO member will be able to deny it if America and Germany jointly press for it. Yeah. On we go. Oh. In the current circumstances, the expansion of NATO to include Poland, the Czech Republic and Hungary, probably by 1999, appears to be likely. After this initial but significant step, it is likely that any subsequent expansion of the alliance will either be coincidental with or will follow the expansion of the EU. The latter involves a much more complicated process, both in the number of qualifying stages and in the meeting of membership requirements. Thus, even the first admissions into the EU from Central Europe are not likely to be before the year 2002 or perhaps somewhat later. Nonetheless, after the first 3 new NATO members have also joined the EU, both the EU and NATO will have to address the question of extending membership to the Baltic republics, Slovenia, Romania, Bulgaria and Slovakia, and perhaps also eventually to Ukraine. It is noteworthy that the prospect of eventual membership is already exercising a constructive influence on the affairs and conduct of would-be members. Knowledge that neither the EU nor NATO wishes to be burdened by additional conflicts pertaining either the minority rights or to territorial claims among their members has already given Slovakia, Hungary and Romania the needed incentive to reach accommodations that meet the standards set by the Council of Europe. Much the same is true for the more general principle that only democracies can qualify for membership. The desire not to be left out is having an important reinforcing impact on the new democracies. In any case, it ought to be axiomatic that Europe's political unity and security are indivisible. Ah, new words. As a practical matter, in fact, it is difficult to conceive of a truly united Europe without a common security arrangements with America. It follows, therefore, that states that are in a position to begin and are invited to undertake accession talks with the EU should automatically also be viewed henceforth as subject, in effect, to NATO's presumptive protection. Accordingly, the process of widening Europe and enlarging the transatlantic security system is likely to move forward by deliberate stages, assuming sustained American and Western European commitment. A speculative but cautiously realistic timetable for these stages might be the following. First, by 1999, the first new Central European members will have been admitted into NATO, though their entry into the EU will probably not happen before 2002 or 2003. Second, in the meantime, the EU will initiate accession talks with the Baltic republics, and NATO will likewise begin to move forward on the issue of their membership as well as Romania's, with their accession likely to be completed by 2005. At some point in this stage, the other Balkan states may likewise become eligible. Third, accession by the Baltic states might prompt Sweden and Finland also to consider NATO membership. And then point 4 here, somewhere between 2005 and 2010, Ukraine, especially if in the meantime the country has made significant progress in its domestic reforms and has succeeded in becoming more evidently identified as a Central European country, should become ready for serious negotiations with both the EU and NATO. In the meantime, it is likely that Franco-German-Polish collaboration within the EU and NATO will have deepened considerably, especially in the area of defense. That collaboration could become the Western core of any wider European security arrangement that might eventually embrace both Russia and Ukraine. Given the special geopolitical interest of Germany and Poland in Ukraine's independence, it is also quite possible that Ukraine will gradually be drawn into the special Franco-German-Polish relationship. By the year 2010, Franco-German-Polish-Ukrainian political collaboration engaging some 230 million people could evolve into a partnership enhancing Europe's geostrategic depth. See map above. Let's see if I can show you that. So, that is the map. Okay, hopefully you can see that. If you cannot see that, I do apologize. Whether the above scenario emerges in a benign fashion or in the context of intensifying tensions with Russia is of great importance. Russia should be continuously reassured that the doors to Europe are open, as are the doors to its eventual participation in an expanded transatlantic system of security and, perhaps, at some future point, in a new trans-Eurasian system of security. To give credence to these assurances, various cooperative links between Russia and Europe in all fields should be very deliberately promoted. It says here in brackets, Russia's relationship to Europe and the role of Ukraine in that regard are discussed more fully in the next chapter. Yeah, that's true. If Europe succeeds both in unifying and in expanding, and if Russia in the meantime undertakes successful democratic consolidation and social modernization, at some point Russia can also become eligible for a more organic relationship with Europe. That in turn would make possible the eventual merger of the transatlantic security system with the transcontinental Eurasian one. However, as a practical reality, the question of Russia's formal membership will not arise for quite some time to come, and that, if anything, is yet another reason for not pointlessly shutting the doors to it. To conclude, with Europe of Yalta gone, it is essential that there be no reversion to the Europe of Versailles. The end of the division of Europe should not precipitate a step back to a Europe of quarrelsome nation-states, but should be the point of departure for shaping a larger and increasingly integrated Europe, reinforced by a widened NATO and rendered even more secure by a constructive security relationship with Russia. Hence, America's central geostrategic goal in Europe can be summed up quite simply. It is to consolidate through a more genuine transatlantic partnership the US bridgehead on the Eurasian continent, so that an enlarging Europe can become a more viable springboard for projecting into Eurasia the international democratic and cooperative order. Okay, the next chapter is called The Black Hole. It's chapter 4. Here he's talking about Russia's history a little bit, and how the history of Russia has kind of constructed the status they have now. So it goes blah 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 blah, and then I start here. One cannot overstate the horrors and tribulations that have befallen the Russian people in the course of this century. Hardly a single Russian family has had the opportunity to lead a normal, civilized existence. Consider the social implications of the following sequence of events. The Russo-Japanese War of 1905, ending in Russia's humiliating defeat. Then the First Proletarian Revolution of 1905, igniting large-scale urban violence. World War I, which was from 1914 to 1918, although it states here 1917, with its millions of casualties and massive economic dislocation. The Civil War of 1918 to 1921, again consuming several million lives and devastating the land. Then the Russo-Polish War of 1919 to 1920, ending in a Russian defeat. The launching of the Gulag in the early 1920s, including the decimation of the pre-revolutionary elite and its large-scale exodus from Russia. The industrialization and collectivization drives of the early and mid-1930s, which generated massive famines and millions of deaths in Ukraine and Kazakhstan. The Great Purges and Terror of the mid and late 1930s, with millions incarcerated in labor camps and upward of 1 million shot and several million dying from maltreatment. Then we come to World War II, 1941 till 1945, with its multiple millions of military and civilian casualties and vast economic devastation. The reimposition of Stalinist terror in the late 1940s, again involving large-scale arrests and frequent executions. The 40-year-long arms race with the United States, lasting from the late 1940s to the late 1980s, with its socially impoverishing effects. The economically exhausting efforts to project Soviet power into the Caribbean, Middle East and Africa during the 1970s and 80s, and the debilitating war in Afghanistan from 1979 to 1989, and then the sudden breakup of the Soviet Union, followed by civil disorders, a painful economic crisis, and the bloody and humiliating war against Chechnya. Not only was the crisis in Russia's internal condition and the loss of international status distressingly unsettling, especially for the Russian political elite, But Russia's geopolitical situation was also adversely affected. In the West, as a consequence of the Soviet Union's disintegration, Russia's frontiers had been altered most painfully, and its sphere of geopolitical influence had dramatically shrunk. The Baltic states had been Russian-controlled since the 1700s, and the loss of the ports of Riga and Tallinn made Russia's access to the Baltic Sea more limited and subject to winter freezes. Although Moscow managed to retain a politically dominant position in the formerly newly independent but highly Russified Belarus, it was far from certain that the nationalist contagion would not eventually also gain the upper hand there as well. And beyond the frontiers of the former Soviet Union, the collapse of the Warsaw Pact meant that the former satellite states of Central Europe, foremost among them Poland, were rapidly gravitating toward NATO and the European Union. Most troubling of all was the loss of Ukraine. The appearance of an independent Ukrainian state not only challenged all Russians to rethink the nature of their own political and ethnic identity, but it represented a vital geopolitical setback for the Russian state. The repudiation of more than 300 years of Russian imperial history meant the loss of a potentially rich industrial and agricultural economy and of 52 million people ethnically and religiously sufficiently close to the Russians to make Russia into a truly large and confident imperial state. Ukraine's independence also deprived Russia of its dominant position on the Black Sea, where Odessa had served as Russia's vital gateway to trade with the Mediterranean and the world beyond. The loss of Ukraine was geopolitically pivotal for it drastically limited Russia's geostrategic options. Even without the Baltic states and Poland, a Russia that retained control over Ukraine could still seek to be the leader of an assertive Eurasian empire, in which Moscow could dominate the non-Slavs in the south and southeast of the former Soviet Union. But without Ukraine and its 52 million fellow Slavs, any attempt by Moscow to rebuild the Eurasian Empire was likely to leave Russia entangled alone in protracted conflicts with the nationally and religiously aroused non-Slavs. The war with Chechnya perhaps simply being the first example. Moreover, given Russia's declining birth rate and the explosive birth rate among the Central Asians, any new Eurasian entity based purely on Russian power without Ukraine would inevitably become less European and more Asiatic with each passing year. The loss of Ukraine was not only geopolitically pivotal but also geopolitically catalytic. It was Ukrainian actions, the Ukrainian Declaration of Independence in December 1991, its insistence in the critical negotiations in Belarus that the Soviet Union should be replaced by a looser Commonwealth of independent states, and especially the sudden coup-like imposition of Ukrainian command over the Soviet army units stationed on Ukrainian soil that prevented the CIS from becoming merely a new name for a more confederal USSR. Ukraine's political self-determination stunned Moscow and set an example that the other Soviet republics, though initially more timidly, then followed. Russia's loss of its dominant position on the Baltic Sea was replicated on the Black Sea, not only because of Ukraine's independence, but also because the newly independent Caucasian states, that's Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan. So, Ukraine has been independent since 1991. I don't quite understand what the problem then is. So, okay. Okay. Anyway, it goes on to say here, perhaps that disappointment might have been averted if earlier on during the American-Russian honeymoon, America had embraced the concept of NATO expansion and had at the same time offered Russia a deal it could not refuse, namely a special cooperative relationship between Russia and NATO. Had America clearly and decisively embraced the idea of widening the alliance with the stipulation that Russia should somehow be included in the process, perhaps Moscow's subsequent sense of disappointment with the mature relationship, as well as the progressive weakening of the political position of the westernizers in the Kremlin, might have been averted. The moment to have done so was during the second half of 1993, right after Yeltsin's public endorsement in August of Poland's interest in joining the transatlantic alliance as being consistent with the interests of Russia. Instead, the Clinton administration, then still pursuing its Russia First policy, agonized for 2 more years while the Kremlin changed its tune and became increasingly hostile to the emerging but indecisive signals of the American intention to widen NATO. By the time Washington decided in 1996 to make NATO enlargement a central goal in America's policy and of shaping a larger and more secure Euro-Atlantic community, the Russians had locked themselves into rigid opposition. Hence the year 1993 might be viewed as the year of a missed historic opportunity. Admittedly, not all of the Russian concerns regarding NATO expansion lacked legitimacy. Admittedly, not all of the Russian concerns regarding NATO expansion lacked legitimacy. You know what I mean. Or were motivated by malevolent motives. Some opponents, to be sure, especially among the Russian military, partook of a Cold War mentality, viewing NATO expansion not as an integral part of Europe's own growth, but rather as the advance toward Russia of an American-led and still hostile alliance. Some of the Russian foreign policy elite, most of whom were actually former Soviet officials, persisted in the long-standing geostrategic view that America had no place in Eurasia and that NATO expansion was largely driven by the American desire to increase its sphere of influence. Well, it's always good to have maybe a president who's more America-friendly in Russia, so that would have helped. Some of their opposition also derived from the hope that an unattached Central Europe would someday again revert to Moscow's sphere of geopolitical influence once Russia had regained its health. But many Russian Democrats also feared that the expansion of NATO would mean that Russia would be left outside of Europe, ostracized politically, and considered unworthy of membership in the institutional framework of European civilization. Cultural insecurity compounded the political fears, making NATO expansion seem like the culmination of the long-standing Western policy designed to isolate Russia. Now, where are we now? Leaving it alone in the world and vulnerable to its various enemies. Moreover, the Russian Democrats simply could not grasp the depth either of the Central Europeans' resentment over half a century of Moscow's domination or of their desire to be part of a larger Euro-Atlantic system. Now, I think I will stop here. I will just read you the conclusion of this book. Tidying up in the meantime. So, okay, on we go. Conclusion. The time has come for the United States to formulate and prosecute an integrated, comprehensive and long-term geostrategy for all of Eurasia. This need arises out of the interaction between two fundamental realities. America is now the only global superpower, and Eurasia is the globe's central arena. Basically the chessboard, hence the Grand Chessboard. Hence, what happens to the distribution of power on the Eurasian continent will be of decisive importance to America's global primacy and to America's historical legacy. American global primacy is unique in its scope and character. It is a hegemony of a new type that reflects many of the features of the American democratic system. It is pluralistic, permeable, and flexible. Attained in the course of less than a century, the principal geopolitical manifestation of that hegemony is America's unprecedented role on the Eurasian landmass, hitherto the point of origin of all previous contenders for global power. America is now Eurasia's arbiter, with no major Eurasian issue soluble without America's participation or contrary to America's interests. How the United States both manipulates and accommodates the principal geostrategic players on the Eurasian chessboard, and how it manages Eurasia's key geopolitical pivots will be critical to the longevity and stability of America's global primacy. In Europe, the key players will continue to be France and Germany, and America's central goal should be to consolidate and expand the existing democratic bridgehead on Eurasia's western periphery. In Eurasia's far east, China is likely to be increasingly central, and America will not have a political foothold on the Asian mainland unless an American-Chinese geostrategic consensus is successfully nurtured. In the center of Eurasia, the space between an enlarging Europe and a regionally rising China will remain a geopolitically black hole, at least until Russia resolves its inner struggle over its post-imperial self-definition, while the region to the south of Russia, the Eurasian Balkans, threatens to become a cauldron of ethnic conflict and great power rivalry. In that context, oh God, my reading is getting really bad now. Sorry. In that context, for some time to come, for more than a generation, America's status of the world's premier power is unlikely to be contested by any single challenger. No nation state is likely to match America in the four key dimensions of power, which is military, economic, technological, and cultural. That cumulatively produce decisive global political clout. Short of a deliberate or unintentional American short of a deliberate or unintentional American abdication, the only real alternative to American global leadership. That was a Freudian slip, leadership. I do apologize. I'm gonna read that again. Really apologize. Oh no! Now I'm having one of those laughing fits. Honestly, short of a deliberate or unintentional American abdication, the only real alternative to American global leadership in the foreseeable future is international anarchy. In that respect, it is correct to assert that America has become, as President Clinton put it, the world's indispensable nation. It is important to stress here both the fact that of that indispensability and the actuality of the potential for global anarchy. The disruptive consequences of population explosion, poverty-driven migration, radicalizing urbanization, ethnic and religious hostilities, and the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction would become unmanageable if the existing and underlying nation-state-based framework of even rudimentary geopolitical stability were itself to fragment. Without sustained and directed American involvement, before long the forces of global disorder could come to dominate the world scene. And the possibility of such a fragmentation is inherent in the geopolitical tensions not only of today's Eurasia, but of the world more generally. The resulting risks to global stability are likely to be further increased by the prospect of a more general degradation of the human condition, particularly in the poorer countries of the world. The demographic explosion and the simultaneous urbanization of these populations are rapidly generating a congestion not only of the disadvantaged, but especially of the hundreds of millions of unemployed and increasingly restless young, whose level of frustration is growing in an exponential rate. Modern communications intensify their rupture with traditional authority, whilst making them increasingly conscious and resentful of global inequality and thus more susceptible to extremist mobilization. On the one hand, the rising phenomenon of global migrations, already reaching into the tens of millions, may act as a temporary safety valve, but on the other hand, it is also likely to serve as a vehicle for the transcontinental conveyance of ethnic and social conflicts. The global stewardship that America has inherited is hence likely to be buffeted by turbulence, tension, and at least sporadic violence. The new and complex international order, shaped by American hegemony, and within which the threat of war is off the table, keep saying that, is likely to be restricted to those parts of the world where American power has been reinforced by democratic socio-political systems and by elaborate external, multilateral, but also American-dominated frameworks. An American geostrategy for Eurasia will thus be competing with the forces of turbulence. In Europe, there are signs that the momentum for integration and enlargement is waning, and that traditional European nationalisms may reawaken before long. Large-scale unemployment persists, even in the most successful European states, breeding xenophobic reactions that could suddenly cause a lurch in French or German politics towards significant political extremism and inward-orientated chauvinism. Indeed, a genuinely pre-revolutionary situation could even be in the making. The historical timetable for Europe, outlined in Chapter 3, will be met only if Europe's aspirations for unity are both encouraged and even prodded by the United States. The uncertainties regarding Russia's future are even greater, and the prospects for a positive evolution much more tenuous. It is therefore imperative for America to shape a geopolitical context that is congenial to Russia's assimilation into a larger setting of growing European cooperation, and that also fosters the self-reliant independence of its newly sovereign neighbors. Yet the viability of, say, Ukraine or Uzbekistan, not to speak of the ethnically bifurcated Kazakhstan, will remain uncertain, especially if American attention becomes diverted by a new internal crisis in Europe, by a growing gap between Turkey and Europe, or by intensifying hostility in American-Iranian relations. The potential for an eventual grand accommodation with China could also be aborted by a future crisis over Taiwan, or because internal Chinese political dynamics prompt the emergence of an aggressive and hostile regime, or simply because American-Chinese relations turn sour. Tja, it just goes on here, on and on. Yeah, I'll leave that out, and then a geostrategy for Eurasia, the point of departure for the needed policy has to be hard-nosed recognition of the three unprecedented conditions that currently define the geopolitical state of world affairs. For the first time in history, a single state is a truly global power. A non-Eurasian state is globally the preeminent state, and the globe's central arena, Eurasia, is dominated by a non-Eurasian power. However, a comprehensive and integrated geostrategy for Eurasia must also be based on recognition of the limits of America's effective power and the inevitable attrition over time of its scope. As noted earlier, the very scale and diversity of Eurasia, as well as the potential power of some of its states, limit the depth of American influence and the degree of control over the course of events. This condition places a premium on geostrategic insight and on the deliberately selective deployment of America's resources on the huge Eurasian chessboard. And since America's unprecedented power is bound to diminish over time, the priority must be to manage the rise of other regional powers in ways that do not threaten America's global primacy. As in chess, American global planners must think several moves ahead, anticipating possible counter-moves. A sustainable geostrategy must therefore distinguish between the short-run perspective, which is next year to up the next 5 years, the middle term, up to 20 or so years, and the long run, beyond 20 years. Moreover, these phases must be viewed not as watertight compartments, but as part of a continuum. The first phase must gradually and consistently lead into the second, indeed, be deliberately pointed toward it, and the second must then lead subsequently into the third. In the short run, it is in America's interest to consolidate and perpetuate the prevailing geopolitical pluralism on the map of Eurasia, that puts a premium on maneuver and manipulation in order to prevent the emergence of a hostile coalition that could eventually seek to challenge America's primacy. Not to mention the remote possibility of any one particular state seeking to do so. By the middle term, the foregoing should gradually yield to a greater emphasis on the emergence of increasingly important but strategically compatible partners who, prompted by American leadership, might help to shape a more cooperative trans-Eurasian security system. Eventually, in the much longer run still, the foregoing could phase into a global core of genuinely shared political responsibility. The most immediate task is to make certain that no state or combination of states gains the capacity to expel the United States from Eurasia or even to diminish significantly its decisive arbitrating role. However, the consolidation of transcontinental geopolitical pluralism should not be viewed as an end in itself, but only as a means to achieve the middle-term goal of shaping genuine strategic partnerships in the key regions of Eurasia. It is unlikely that democratic America will wish to be permanently engaged in the difficult and absorbing and costly task of managing Eurasia by constant manipulation and maneuver, backed by American military resources, in order to prevent regional domination by any one power. The first phase must, therefore, logically and deliberately lead into the second, one in which a benign American hegemony still discourages others from posing a challenge, not only by making the costs of the challenge too high, but also by not threatening the vital interests of Eurasia's potential regional aspirants. What that requires specifically as the middle-term goal is the fostering of genuine partnerships, predominant among them those with a more united and politically defined Europe and with a regionally preeminent China, as well as with, one hopes, a post-imperial and Europe-orientated Russia, and on the southern fringe of Eurasia with a regionally stabilizing and democratic India. But it will be the success or failure of the effort to forge broader strategic relationships with Europe and China, respectively, that will shape the defining context for Russia's role, either positive or negative. It follows that a wider Europe and an enlarged NATO will serve well both the short-term and the longer-term goals of US policy. A larger Europe will expand the range of American influence and, through the admission of new Central European members, also increase in the European councils the number of states with a pro-American proclivity, without simultaneously creating a Europe politically so integrated that it could soon challenge the United States on geopolitical matters of high importance to America elsewhere, particularly in the Middle East. A politically defined Europe is also essential to the progressive assimilation of Russia into a system of global cooperation. Admittedly, America cannot on its own generate a more united Europe. That is up to the Europeans, especially the French and the Germans. But America can obstruct the emergence of a more united Europe, and that could prove calamitous for stability in Eurasia, and thus also for America's own interests. Indeed, unless Europe becomes more united, it is likely to become more disunited again. Accordingly, as stated earlier, it is vital that America work closely with both French and Germans in seeking a Europe that is politically viable, a Europe that remains linked to the United States, and a Europe that widens the scope of cooperative democratic international system. Making a choice between France and Germany is not the issue. Without either France or Germany, there will be no Europe. And without Europe, there will be no trans-Eurasian system. Trans-Eurasian system. In practical terms, the foregoing will require gradual accommodation to a shared leadership in NATO, greater acceptance of France's concerns for a European role, not only in Africa, but also in the Middle East, and continued support for the eastward expansion of the EU, even as the EU becomes a more politically and economically assertive global player. A transatlantic free trade agreement between... Oh, unfortunately, I just jumped the lines here. A transatlantic free trade agreement, already advocated by a number of prominent Atlantic leaders, could also mitigate the risk of growing economic rivalry between a more united EU and the United States. In any case, the EU's eventual success in burying the centuries-old European nationalist antagonists with their globally disruptive effects would be well worth some gradual diminution in America's decisive role as Eurasia's current arbitrator. Now, the Transatlantic Free Trade Agreement, there is the so-called TTIP, which is heavily in discussion, and that mostly because nobody is allowed to see the contents of this agreement. Nevertheless, European Union members have been asked to vote for it, and the contents of this TTIP are apparently really devastating, and it absolutely fits the box here. And again, he's already talking about this many years ago, so it is mind-boggling to me. The enlargement of NATO and the EU would serve to reinvigorate Europe's own waning sense of a larger vocation, while consolidating, to the benefit of both America and Europe, the democratic gains won through the successful termination of the Cold War. At stake in this effort is nothing less than America's long-range relationship with Europe itself. A new Europe is still taking shape, and if that new Europe is to remain geopolitically a part of the Euro-Atlantic space, the expansion of NATO is essential. By the same token, a failure to widen NATO, now that the commitment has been made, would shatter the concept of an expanding Europe and demoralize the Central Europeans. It could even reignite currently dormant or dying Russian geopolitical aspirations in Central Europe. Indeed, the failure of the American-led effort to expand NATO, I will repeat, indeed, the failure of the American-led effort to expand NATO could reawaken even more ambitious Russian desires. It is not yet evident, and the historical record is strongly to the contrary, that the Russian political elite shares Europe's desire for a strong and enduring American political and military presence. Yeah, in Germany we know a lot about that because we've got a lot of American military presence. Therefore, while the fostering of an increasingly cooperative relationship with Russia is clearly desirable, it is important for America to send a clear message about its global priorities. If a choice has to be made between a larger Euro-Atlantic system and a better relationship with Russia, the former has to rank incomparably higher to America. For that reason, any accommodation with Russia on the issue of NATO enlargement should not entail an outcome that has the effect of making Russia a de facto decision-maker member of the alliance, thereby diluting NATO's special Euro-Atlantic character while simultaneously relegating its newly admitted members to second-class status. That would create opportunities for Russia to resume not only the effort to regain a sphere of influence in Central Europe, but to use its presence within NATO to play on any American-European disagreements in order to reduce the American role in European affairs. It is also crucial that, as Central Europe enters NATO, any new security assurances to Russia regarding the region be truly reciprocal and thus mutually reassuring. Restrictions on the deployment of NATO troops and nuclear weapons on the soil of new members can be an important factor in allaying legitimate Russian concerns, but these should be matched with symmetrical Russian assurances regarding the demilitarization of the potentially strategically menacing salient of Kaliningrad, and by limits on major troop deployments near the borders of the prospective new members of NATO and the EU. So it's okay if the Americans put their military kind of across the world, but if Russia is doing that, that's really dangerous. While all of Russia's newly independent Western neighbors are anxious to have a stable and cooperative relationship with Russia, the fact is that they continue to fear it for historically understandable reasons. Hence, the emergence of an equitable NATO-EU accommodation with Russia would be welcomed by all Europeans as a signal that Russia is finally making the much-desired post-imperial choice in favor of Europe. That choice could pave the way for a wider effort to enhance Russia's status and esteem, formal membership in the G7, as well as the upgrading of the policy-making machinery of the OSCE, could create opportunities for constructive Russian engagement in shaping both the political and security dimensions of Europe. Yeah, I think I will leave it here. For you, to get this book and read it. It is really, really very interesting. I've got a couple of other books from Mr. Brzezinski I haven't read yet. Took me quite some time to go through this, because the way these political books are written is just, my mind wanders off after a couple of lines, and then I have to reread the same sentences again and again till it really clicks. So yeah, I hope you enjoyed it. I certainly enjoyed it, especially the little laughing fit in the middle. And as soon as I've read something else interesting, then I will of course share that. I hope you all had a really nice weekend, and I hope you have an excellent start to the week. Maybe the weather will become better again, would be nice. Anyhow, see you soon. Goodbye.